just joined us. Yes, this is the WCA webinar series. We'll just be starting in probably about 20 seconds. We're just going to give opportunity for everyone to log in. So yeah, we've got quite a lot of participants today. I think this is a topic that obviously everyone's very interested in. So yeah, we'll be starting in probably, I don't know, less than a minute. So we'll just give time for everyone to log in. I think we've got enough people that have already logged in. They'll probably still keep joining. But good afternoon, everyone. This is the Wine Communicators of Australia webinar. I'm Ruth Harris. I'm the Executive Chair here at Wine Communicators. Thanks for joining us for the webinar. So I'm hosting this webinar from Kaurna country, and I acknowledge all the traditional custodians of the various lands that you all work on today, all over Australia, as well as any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us today on the webinar. We pay our respects to elders past and present and celebrate the diverse culture and the strong connection that Aboriginal people have to our land and waters in Australia. Today we'll be joined by Trish Barry, who you can already see from Mastermind Consulting, for a look at social media in 2025, the new rules of digital engagement. So just a little bit of background on Trish. She's the 2020 Wine Communicator of the Year and won the Best Digital Wine Communicator in that same year. Her contribution to the industry is significant. She served 5 years on the WCA committee and has been a mentor in the Wine Industry Mentor Program. She sits on the board of AWRI and as an advisor to the Wine Committee for the Royal Agricultural Society of New South Wales. Trish started her career in investment banking before moving into wine brand marketing for famous brands at Southcorp. In 2008, she founded Mastermind Consulting, and since then she has built a highly successful business with a focus on wine marketing, strategy, and direct-to-consumer planning, something that everyone is very interested in at the moment. She's been a regular panelist and educating our members on social media for nearly 2 decades, and she's a digital native with years of campaign experience. So I'm delighted to share for Trish to share some insights into what social media looks like in 2025. Today's presentation will actually take about 50 minutes. Usually our presentations end sort of around 40 minutes with time for questions, so there won't be a huge amount of time for live questions. So please do put them in the Q&A. So if you look down to the bottom of this screen, there's a Q&A box and there's like a chat box. We'd like you to put questions in the Q&A box because these are saved at the end of the webinar, and so that we can respond to any which we're unable to answer live. We're also recording this webinar, so the link to recording will be sent out to you later today, so you can view it again or watch it with a colleague. So right now, it's my pleasure to hand over to Trish Barry, today's presenter.
Thank you, Ruth, and lovely to join you today. Wine Communicators has been such a special part of my journey, so it's always a privilege to be able to host this session. My first day in the industry, I was taken to a Wine Press Club of New South Wales event, and so it's become a really important part of sharing communications, particularly around digital. And I think it's quite fitting that today is a 15-year milestone since we held the very first Wine Communicators of Australia social media marketing forum. And back in those days, this was really new. We had seen the emergence, obviously, of Facebook. Instagram was barely even born at that point in 2009. And what really excited me coming out of Australia's first digital agency was the opportunity for wine brands to tell their stories direct to consumers. And I thought it was quite fitting. If you look on the right-hand side, some of those tips were things like, make sure that you've got a direct dialogue with your customer. This is a widely underutilized channel. But equally, the relationships that you can build directly with your customers through these mediums becomes incredibly important. So it's kind of fitting that 15 years down the track, we're having another look at this because the world has changed incredibly. And the way that I've seen social and digital evolve has very much been moving from that generalist approach where social became a little bit, as an add-on to what we were doing, to a very specialized skill set. And I'm super proud that my small but mighty team has a range of specialists, from content creators to social media strategists and communicators, email marketing specialists, paid media specialists, and being able to bring all of that together. It has been a real joy to be able to work with my team on this presentation. So I don't profess to be the expert on all of this content. So happy to reach out and be able to share some of those news pieces and be able to dig a bit deeper if you have further questions. So let's get into it. There's a lot we're going to cover today, and often we talk about social media and digital in a one-day workshop. But I wanted to jam-pack this session for you today and give you an insight in some of the changes that we've seen, what other brands are doing social media well, where you should put your focus. I know many of you are in small family wine businesses, and so your resources are really stretched and constrained. So how do you get the most out of the use on these platforms? And then how do you measure your success? And I think it's worth acknowledging up front that there are so many platforms to play with, and your strategy needs to very much be driven by your consumers, your brand messages, and your overall marketing strategy. But given the reliance for so many wineries on the Meta platform, so Instagram and Facebook in particular, we're going to spend most of the focus on those two social media platforms because they represent probably 70% of the time brands that we're working with are spending on the platforms. So let's dig into it and give you a bit of an insight. We're still seeing social media play a really important role in the digital ecosystem. And each day, consumers who are over the age of 18 in Australia are using these platforms for nearly 2 hours. Even with the total internet use being very prevalent, this is a really key part of a digital use from a consumer perspective. We're seeing the number of social media platforms that are used vary between different age groups, but on average, consumers are using about 6 social media platforms in the mix. We're also seeing that age demographic very much spreading. So we're seeing lots of younger people, obviously, on the platforms that are really native, but also equally the over 65-year-old age group are also quite involved in the platforms. How they use this information, how they behave online is obviously very different, but it's a good point to make that across all age groups, there is utilization of social media. Meta continues to be the kind of big one. So you'll see Facebook, Messenger, Instagram are the most used social media platforms. And this information is coming from Meltwater and We Are Social that update this information each year to give us a bit of a snapshot on what is changing and what is evolving. We're seeing brands like TikTok and Snapchat as new platforms obviously come into the mix. And depending on your wine brand or your interests, some of these have relevance depending on who your target market is. But across the age groups, we're seeing lots of social media platforms being used. So what are the big changes you need to be aware of? Some of the things that continue to evolve are that the algorithms behind these platforms continue to evolve. And particularly with some of the bigger platforms that are publicly listed companies, we've seen that the mediums have moved from being connections with friends to more about a creator economy. So how are you entertaining people? How are you going onto these platforms to be able to engage with different pieces of content? We've moved away from it being a social media sharing platform where you might be sharing your information with friends to being able to discover different brands. And AI is now having a really big impact into driving those algorithms and seeing change. We've also seen over the last decade or so, particularly after COVID, that the digital ad spend continues to grow. So this is becoming a much more cluttered environment, and we're seeing it very much about pay to play just because the volume of brands that are on these platforms are continuing to evolve. This is a really different environment, and it means we need to operate a little bit differently. No longer can the old rules start to apply, and we've got to start to evolve the presence that we have on these platforms. Noting that these platforms are publicly listed entities and they're trying to drive engagement is shifting and shaping the priorities of the platforms very differently. So you see Meta coming out there at the moment. They've made a statement yesterday that they want to own AI. They want to be able to continue to roll out new tools and platforms that allow them to get in front of the right audiences. So they're testing different chatbots, they're testing different pieces of creative, and they want to be a social discovery platform that is bringing a younger demographic back in. And that's why they're investing so much in their AI, in Instagram, in some of their messenger chat options, is something that they're doing to be able to make sure that they remain relevant. Equally, we're seeing TikTok emerge, particularly for a younger demographic, as a source of discovery. So they're focusing on personalization, entertainment, engagement. But don't ignore some of the other smaller platforms. We're not going to delve into YouTube and LinkedIn in a great amount of detail together today, but these platforms also have a massive opportunity to really think about how you're building community engagement and storytelling. One of the big things to think about is that social media is being used very much now as a search platform, particular for a younger audience. So where some of the audiences would start with Google, particularly an older demographic that might have been over 40 would start on Google for search. Social is very much being used as a search engine. If you look at how your, teenagers and the younger generations are using, they'll go to TikTok to look up a restaurant. They'll go and have a look on Instagram and search for those kind of trending recipes and information. So the way that the audiences are using this information continues to evolve. We're finding that YouTube's rise as a search engine is really prioritizing that search first approach. So if you're looking at things like how-to guides, useful information, it is a very powerful search platform as how it's being used. Now we're seeing this landscape evolve, and it's worth thinking about Google and how Google is evolving, because Google is often the first place that we used to go for brand discovery. And it's worth noting that there are now nearly 5 trillion Google searches every year. 83% of people across the globe are using Google or YouTube daily, and YouTube is having a much more prevalent presence in terms of how people are finding this information. But Google is evolving, and they're using these really powerful large language models to be more suggestive in terms of getting content to the consumer. And that's meaning we're having to stop and rethink our approach to online digital marketing and how our brand is showing up in some of these algorithms. Something that you might have noticed when you look on Google over the last few months, since it was kind of mid-May where these algorithms started to becoming more relevant, where these featured snippets from an AI overview was starting to come into your search results. So I've just typed in here, when is Shiraz Day? And you can see this AI overview is coming up with a very succinct snippet in terms of giving the answers to consumers. And if consumers are getting that information, they may not need to click further into your content to be able to get the information. You can see to the right, there is obviously still brands that obviously come up in that mix, and your featured snippet, luckily Mastermind's coming up #1 here in terms of the information that's coming through, is really evolving. And we've seen a really significant decline in search traffic over the last few months from websites into how this is playing out. Now, what does that mean for us as a brand marketer? It means that we need to measure this differently. We need to think about our content differently because it's still really early days and we're not quite sure how relevant this information is. You know, what we're looking for is that clear, structured information to help consumers get the information that they're looking for. Last week, we saw Meta come into the search playground even further. So starting from July the 10th, we're starting to see the content that comes up on search results, including publicly indexed content from social media. So this could be a YouTube video, it could be Instagram, it could be your Facebook posts. This does exclude the private accounts and personal accounts, and it also excludes content that was posted prior to the 1st of January. But we need to think about search very differently now and think about how our social media content strategies, the language that we're using, some of the words that we're starting to use as we're writing our social content, how that is relevant for social going forward. So painting a bit of a different picture about what the world of digital now looks like, let's drill down a little bit further into how are brands using social media. And I guess regardless of whether you're doing business to business marketing or business to consumer marketing, you can see here by this report from HubSpot that social media is being used by brands across different platforms. It's a difference. Obviously, some brands are using YouTube more. You're seeing B2B brands use it in a little bit different way, but be really clear of who your customer is when you're approaching this environment. For many brands, social media still very much is on the radar because of brand awareness. So we know if we're looking at some of the reports, the why in terms of why social media is often about brand discovery, it's about building word of mouth, but it plays a very important role, particularly for different audience segments, in making sure that your brand is discovered and found. And this pays a little bit of an insight into those different age groups and how that social media brand discovery plays such a role. So from the audiences who are aged 16 to 34, you can see that social media ads are the #1 social proof of finding a new brand. Now, social media comments also plays a bit of a role here, but you can see how important that is if you're bringing a younger consumer into your brand to make sure that you have a solid presence here. It's a little bit different for different demographics. And if you have a look at that over 55 audience, you're still seeing some of the more traditional mediums playing a role, but social media is still part of the mix. So think about how that is really relevant for your brand, but don't put all of your eggs in this basket. If you look at the volatility that's happening across many of these platforms, we always make the point that you shouldn't build your house on foreign soil. And if you think about some of the risks involved in this, we could see any of these platforms evolve very quickly at any point of time. And we've seen that obviously over the last few months. So use social strategically as part of your marketing mix, but don't neglect the things that you can own and control. And we'll talk about that over the next half an hour about how some of the social media brands we're working with in terms of campaigns are actually diminishing a little bit on focus. Because if you're resource constrained, you need to put your time on the things that are building the biggest impact for your marketing budget. So brand building strategy and having a framework around how you're approaching social media has never been more important. Going back into the why, building the strategy first, of which social fits into, is a really important part of your communications plan. And we continue to say, focus on the things that you can control. So we're seeing cookies start to impact where we can retarget. We're seeing first-party data becoming a really important part of your marketing toolkit as privacy is starting to change. So don't lose focus on the things that you can control to be able to tell a story, just because there's often shiny tools out there in terms of new platforms or things to play with. And we talk about email marketing really as one of the fundamental drivers that wine brands need to be focusing on first. So much so that we, are bringing email marketing specialists into our team. We're focusing on those user journeys because this chart tells you a real story. So you can see this is a bit of a data snap from some of our clients and their online presence last year. And you can see the role of email here being quite small. So less than 10% of website users are being driven by email. But on average, over 50% of the revenue that wineries are driving online is coming from email. So it's really critical to think about this as an ecosystem because they all play a role. You need to have good content. You need to have a great website experience that is fast, reliable, and very much in tune with what your customers are looking for. But in terms of giving you focus, email is often where you would start. And it's really exciting to see how much some of those platforms have evolved. And this is giving you a little bit of an insight into some of the user journeys that can happen on Klaviyo, where you can set up really great rules and trigger journeys and user journeys to be much more personalized in your email results. So if someone orders a wine from you, you can think about what that journey looks like by being really personal and relevant and giving information in a really meaningful way. And this is where I would start from a digital presence, making sure that you have those email captures right, making sure that you're getting really good data capture in your cellar door, and then building your ecosystem very strategically to make sure that that works. So that's kind of painting digital picture. Let's drill down a little bit on social media. And if you're spending your time on these platforms, how do you make sure that the time is well spent? Our greatest advice to you is that no longer are the algorithms rewarding content that has to be going up every day. So once upon a time, it might have been a decade ago now, the frequency of posting was a really big algorithm driver. So making sure that you continue to be posting that content. But for anyone who's trying to be able to resource this, you'll find that that's a really quick way of burning out. So our advice is to do less, but make sure what you are doing is done really well. So think about the resources that you have because your resources and your capacity within your team will often dictate this strategy. And it may be that you get a really good hub of activity and then you draw on some experts to be able to build on things like paid advertising or content creation. It's lovely Emily Hay, who's just joining our team in 2 weeks' time, often talks about this at some of the social media digital webinars that she's spoken at, where she talks about the fact that we don't have unicorns within our marketing departments. So think about the skills that you have, think about the team capacity that you have, and then build your framework around that. The digital picnic also talks about an impact which they call the Pac-Man kind of effect. So if you're posting multiple times every day, your content continues to be cannibalized. So stretching that content out to give that content time to breathe and have time for it to be able to be picked up by the algorithms, for people to be able to see that content is really critical. But also remember that the algorithms and organic content continues to decline in reach. So you need to be able to think about how do you build a plan around this social media ecosystem so that you're doing this really well. And we always say start with a plan in place because it's so time consuming to feel that need to be able to just having to be posting on a really regular basis. And consistency is important, but understanding what your business goals and why you're on these platforms is critically important. So the reality is that for many of you on this call who have a small business, making sure that you are operating effectively in a really cluttered environment so that the personality and the tone of your brand comes to life is really important. A social media strategy isn't posting really regularly. It's understanding your audience, what mediums they're doing, and how these platforms integrate into your broader marketing mix. Now, this is a bit of theory to that is worth thinking about, because there's also been a real evolution in terms of thinking about how we're approaching marketing. And for many of us, the classic business school was about a funnel. So, back in the days when I was doing my degree, it was very much about that classic marketing approach that we need to build awareness, then we need to move customers down the funnel for consideration, conversion, and then retention. So we were thinking about how we filled the buckets of activity very differently. And in many instances, that still applies, but there's a new school of thought that is called the flywheel. And the flywheel is a little bit more integrated into how it operates. It's thinking about how are we bringing customers into our brand? How are we engaging with them? How are we surprising and delighting them? How are we attracting new customers, but using the customers through word of mouth, through great customer experiences to be much more of a growth model for our business? And this isn't something that just gets owned by the marketing department. It's customer service, it's business teams. It has to be driven by the management of the organization to really put the customer at the center of how we're building our brands. What does the content look like? How are we making sure we're getting good user-generated content? What are the little things that we can do to acquire new customers and really facilitate that word of mouth awareness is really important. So when you're thinking about your marketing planning, really have a conscious thought around what does this flywheel look like? How are we integrating our marketing activities and our social media activities in a more integrated way than just being very granular about this activity is for awareness and this is what we're doing for sales? Now, those of you who have been on some of our webinars before will know that we like to talk about social media in 3 different buckets, and all of them are very important in terms of getting your content seen and making sure that you have this humming across 3 different places. So your organic content is content that you are posting without any money behind it to get it to a new audience. Generally, this will go to people who are within your fold. So people who may follow you, as well as the algorithms getting it to people who might think that this content is relevant. You amplify that content through paid advertising, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But then equally, the part that often gets forgotten as part of this social media mix is the part which is why we're on these platforms in the first place. And that is being social. So equally dedicating as much time into interacting, building, nurturing relationships in your community as there is about creating content becomes incredibly valuable. So we're going to touch on those, but I want you to keep coming back to it. Organic content, how are we amplifying it? How are we managing our community? Because you need to be thinking about how you're resourcing those 3 elements to make your digital plans come to life. So let's talk about organic content. Once upon a time, we were looking at content that was very polished on these platforms. We were making sure that there was a beautiful brand photo shoot, it looked like an ad, and it needed to look super slick. Now what we're seeing is that really human and authentic element shining through in the marketing that we're using on the platforms. So things like behind the scenes content, storytelling, the people behind your brand and some of the staff. This authentic content that is often captured in the moment is a really big part of bringing your story to life. And a good way to think about it is this framework that we found at the social media world last year in San Diego. So they talk about building your organic social content through a framework that is called Excel. So thinking about your audience, your content, your consistency of your messaging being rolled out, the type of engagement that you're having with your consumers on the platforms, and then having liftoff, which we're going to talk about paid. So I'm just going to touch on that, but worth thinking about this framework and writing it down so that as you're planning your monthly content calendars and as you're building your strategies, you're keeping this top of mind. And it might sound quite crazy to start with the audience, but thinking about who our content is aimed at is a really strategic part of our messaging. So understanding your personas, building those personas, giving insights into what matters for those customers drives a lot of the content that you're going to be able to create. Being really clear if your audience is an over 45-year-old male or a younger consumer that is coming into the category will mean that you're creating different content with different languages. Also worth recognizing this shift in terms of audience behavior. So with these privacy concerns, we know that consumers are not commenting on posts the way that they used to. And so that direct message conversation and having engagement in more of a one-to-one relationship is where consumers are looking to go. We're also then starting to think about an evolution of content. And if you think about how you're looking at your social media feeds, the number one place that you are on these social media platforms is often to be entertained or to be looking at family and friends. And so the reaction that the consumers get by looking at your content has to be able to elicit some form of emotional reaction, some sort of story, and be able to generate that really meaningful piece to stop the scroll. Otherwise, the life of that content literally is not even a second. So when you're thinking about it, you have to think about the consumer, what's in it for them, and how is this piece of content actually having purpose for building that emotional storytelling. And that's quite different depending on who the consumers are. And this was a really useful piece that was published when COVID was happening and reminding us as marketers that different generations are taking in content very differently. So if I look at some of my, younger, nieces and nephews in the 20s, it's all about streaming. It's all about, podcasts, online videos. They're consuming content very differently to what a boomer generation would look like. So again, going back to those personas, understanding who you're talking to and the target market will also define your content strategy very differently. There's also been a shift in how you plan this out each month. So once upon a time, you used to be able to plan a content calendar and you used to be able to have much more rigor around what that looked like. Now, those days have evolved. So where we're suggesting that you align your content is very much back to your business goals. What do you need to achieve? Where is social media playing a role? What types of content do you need? Is it video content? Is it long form content? That's going to look really different for each brand depending on what your overall marketing strategy will look like. It's not to say that the content calendar doesn't play a role though. So understanding things like tourism, school holidays, varietal days where you might be able to do a little bit of a different story, collaborations where you might have an event coming up and you need to be able to communicate that. Often the content calendar plays a really important role to fill in some of those parts of must have to be able to make sure that you're relevant and timely. But remember that you need to supplement this. You can't just kind of set and forget. And it's often that more ad hoc content that is going to play a much stronger role. Now, we call this content that is more on the fly and I guess a little bit less curated, the rise of ugly content. And across the world, marketers are using this kind of term for that really authentic content where we're showing up, we're being a little bit vulnerable, and we're putting this content out there to be able to build trust, authenticity, and really give people an understanding about what we stand for as a brand. And we're seeing this happen from big brands to small. This really authentic kind of, less curated content is working really hard. And if you test that in part of your paid ad strategy across all different categories, this is the content that's winning. So we're seeing, these sorts of pieces of influencers that are running, massive billion-dollar kind of campaigns, looking at things where they're getting reach when it's much more curated versus that kind of behind the scenes authentic content. So showing up, you can see here Kiara from Brown Hill Estate, showing up and talking about the top things to do in Margaret River and getting much better engagement than just putting up, a photo or an image that's going to be able to resonate. It's also really important to look at some of the pop culture and be aware of some of the things that are going to resonate. So sometimes it can just be about telling a story in a different way. And you can see here on the left, lovely Bruce Redman, one of our clients, talking about the release of one of their 2016 Cabernets. He was talking very much about how that 2015 vintage meant so much to him, with the medals around his neck, about the show awards that he's had, and talking about how that wine had evolved was much more connectable than just putting a photo of the wine up. Equally, you can see an example from Scarborough last year when Taylor Swift, hit Australia, and really tapping into something that the audience was talking about. So my wine, my time, making sure that we were talking about that in a really relevant way had to be very timely, but is also another great way to start conversations up with your audience. Again, across categories, whether it is from a tourism point of view, from a brand point of view, we see a lot of the bigger retailers leaning into some of this content creation. So the guides, the how-to kind of content, being really useful and very helpful is a great way to connect. And putting your audiences very strategically in the spotlight also brings about that trust and authenticity. So many of you have heard about user-generated content and that importance of UGC. Equally, employer-generated content is really important. And if you think about it, if your staff are willing to be able to tell the story, that also shows, the depth of your team. It shows the storytelling angle, and it's a really good way to be able to build that depth of creativity. But be really clear here about your staff. Make sure that you have expectations outlined, and make sure that you have a social media policy in place, just to make sure that you're covering yourself off. Equally, on Instagram, many of you will have seen these stories being displayed in a carousel format, and carousels are really important as part of your engagement mix. So what happens as you swipe is that the algorithms start to see greater engagement, and it also then starts to mean that different parts of your carousel content may be served again. So this is a really good way of building reach in terms of your content. Potentially, you can have up to 20 different pieces of content in your carousel. But note that if you're going to promote any of this with paid, the limit of the number of pieces of content is 10. And generally, I would say if you can't tell the story in 10 pieces of content, maybe you need to rethink the approach. But again, this is a really important part of thinking about the algorithms and the mix, as are reels and video content. So video is not a new trend. We've been talking about it for a decade. But this week, Facebook announced that all of the content that is going to be up on Facebook is now going to be seen as a reel. So thinking about a video first approach is really critical. Equally, I haven't touched on this, but there is some huge opportunities in terms of thinking about how you're getting someone from one platform to the next. So you can see lots of users on TikTok are using their platform to grow other channels, thinking about how they can get different pieces of content syndicated, maybe from TikTok across to Instagram. So again, think about how these channels are working. What does that look like for your audience? Using the tools that are really native across the platforms, because these continue to evolve. So YouTube is using lots of shorts, lots of ad creative, really starting to think about how they can make it easier for creators or brands to really show up on the platforms and make it successful for you to come up with some really good content. Equally, if you're a B2B brand, and I know there's a couple on this call today, this is really important on LinkedIn. And I'm not going to touch on LinkedIn. We'll run a whole different webinar that we kind of focus just on LinkedIn for B2B marketing. But how you connect and how you're using video is really important. And for the visual learners, also critical to think about how your content is sized. So many of you will have seen that Instagram has changed the post sizes. So it used to be square, it's gone to this more rectangular format. There's some really good guides out there to be able to reframe your content for the right sort of sizing, and easy for you to be able to use some of the templates out there. So whether it's Adobe stock that helps you be able to repurpose that, whether it's Canva and allows you to be able to literally hit that resize button and use that piece of content differently in a different sized format. Go into some of these platforms. We love Canva. There's a really good way that you can put in your brand kit that you're able to optimize. There's now new AI tools to be able to help you be able to animate some of your content. Spend some time exploring these platforms to be able to deliver some really good results. Now, if you're looking at video editing and being able to make more impact on the video sorts of content, and we just talked about why that's so powerful, CapCut is a really good platform to be able to edit that video. We find it's really useful on our phone if we're going to be doing some of the video editing, although shout out to our fabulous Thea in our team, who is obviously much more skilled on this than she is than we are doing it on the fly. But if you're looking for tools to be able to get some really good, simple video editing, CapCut does a really good job, and Instagram has just released a new program that they call Edits, and they're doing that to obviously be able to try and make you stay within their platforms, to make it super easy for you to be able to create that content on Instagram and then share that very easily onto the platform. So stay aware of some of these templates. There's some great different tools out there that you can use depending on what your priorities are. And just finally on content, before I move on, be really conscious of the ABAC code. And I know I'm sounding like the fun police here, but as marketers of alcoholic beverages, we have a real responsibility to really understand what the ABAC code is. So for those of you who don't know what that is, it's the alcohol marketing placement scheme, where we need to be thinking about different things in terms of age gating, types of content that we're showing. I've put up two examples here. One of these is from Liquorland, who put literally a caramello into one of their Easter cocktails they were doing, and one from Wine Pouched, where they were obviously talking about their wine pouches. Both of these complaints are really recent, and they were upheld in terms of responsible marketing. And obviously there are fines, there are warnings. It is really important that you go onto that platform and understand what the obligations are, and just make sure that we're doing a really good job of marketing our products. Okay, so going back to the Excel framework, you'll see that one of the other C's in the Excel framework is consistency. And we're often asked the question, how often should I be posting? Should I be posting at different times of the day, and what does that look like? So this is an opportunity for you to think about the consistency of approach. You do not need to be posting daily. We would give you the advice you post when you have something fabulous to share. But also think about the ability to schedule some of this content when your consumers are online to give it the greatest chance of being seen. So the Meta Business platform gives you the ability to schedule your content. There's some great scheduling tools out there, and test and learn so that you have an awareness of when this is going to, give you the greatest impact. You also need to think about the engagement, one of the other E's, and think about how you're using that engagement and conversation piece to really drive your social media communities. We some days will spend more time actively having conversations, whether it's on LinkedIn, whether it's on Facebook, whether it's on some of the other platforms, than actually posting. So nurturing those communities, making sure that you're warming up the audiences before you post. Often if you're direct messaging someone on Instagram, as an example, and having those conversations, your story is going to come up first in the algorithm. So warming up your audiences, Leaving thoughtful comments, being super useful is really important. And knowing that you need to respond to some of these comments is also really valuable. I can't tell you the amount of times we go onto a social media account when we're doing an audit and go, it's like someone ringing you on the phone and not picking up on the other end. You know, consumers are often wanting to have time, asking you questions, going into the inbox and making sure you're responding is really important. Now, for brands that are a little bit bigger, and this doesn't work for everyone, there's better tools that are coming onto the market to allow you to help automate some of this. So some of you might see platforms like ManyChat being used by some of the bigger brands. This is helping you drive some of that conversations and engagement, not automating everything, but really being clever about how you engage to be able to help you scale. So be aware that there's some tools out there that can help you with that engagement. And regardless of the platform, it's building those communities. So LinkedIn actually values comments on someone's post greater than they do in the algorithm sharing that content. So again, thinking about building that human connection is really important. So I've covered a lot there. Let's talk about Excel. Again, the audience, the content, being really consistent, making sure that you're engaging, and then the L is lift off. And lift off for us actually means putting your social media content into the right eyeballs and the right audience with paid amplification. So we used to early on talk about this of setting your content alight. Now we're talking about this in a very much a pay to play environment. So we know that social media organic content is diminishing. And we know that the bigger brands, you know, like a Meta and like a YouTube are earning revenue through these advertising platforms. The landscape is very much changing and we're seeing AI play a really big role. But if you've got a great combination of your organic content, your paid content, and then that social media community management, this is where you can see some really good results. But don't hit that boost button. We're recommending if you're running the ads, particularly on Meta, that you go and explore the Meta Business Suite. And know that this is the platform that's going to allow you to reach the right audiences. Now, for those of you who are new to this social media advertising, this slide might look a little bit scary, but you can see here the ability to target different placements. So it could be that you're targeting mobile versus desktop versus the audience network versus messenger versus different custom audiences versus different locations and geographic different groups. There is so much potential to be able to think about how you amplify your content. But before you just start to jump in and throw money behind this, be really clear about your why. What is the objective that you're trying to achieve here? Who are you talking to? Do you have the right content strategy in place? Do you have multiple pieces of content to allow you to A/B test and learn different things? And how are you making sure that you're optimizing your results here to make an impact? For some brands, this custom audience is a really good way of starting with your targeting. And if you don't understand what custom audience is, it means that you can upload particular pieces of information into the back end of Meta to start to form an audience. So I might upload the number of people that have bought my Pinot Noir in the last 12 months, and I might just give that information in terms of email addresses into the Meta platform. And then I can tell Meta to be able to create a lookalike audience of that. And I can start to be able to be much more targeted into the customers that I'm talking to. You can also integrate this information with your email flows. So we use this a lot to be really thinking about how you can build much more defined segments. You know, maybe moving in your Klaviyo lists from certain pieces of your audience. It's customers who may have been reactivated and haven't bought before, or different pieces of content just served to your most valuable audiences. This gives you a really powerful platform to play with. Now, Meta, when we're talking about their AI platforms, they obviously are looking at what they call Advantage Plus placements. And this is where they're using their algorithms and AI learnings to really try and recommend content for different types of ads. We see this as a good and a bad thing. If you are starting from scratch and you don't have the benefit of a specialist paid team, sometimes using their recommended settings can give you some options to be able to play with. And where their algorithms are trying to get that content into the right audiences may have some benefits for you to test and to learn. Our team generally tries to turn off as much of this as possible and run this more manual leads campaign because we've got a really clear goal in place before we start those ads of what are we trying to do, who are we trying to target, and what does that look like? And we're finding that some of this Advantage Plus placements and trying to understand some of these meta tips isn't always giving us the best result. So we'll often see recommendations like you'll see on the right-hand page where they're saying, you can have a much better opportunity score if you target a broader audience. And by a broader audience, they're literally asking you to target anyone from 18 to 65 plus. And that may not mean that you're using your budgets really effectively. They're also using AI to be able to give you different types of content that they want to be able to generate. And some of the pieces of creative that we've seen coming from AI might mean that your Chardonnay now has a color that looks like it has a fault, not that really young and fresh and vibrant approach. So be aware that Meta is trying to build revenue. They obviously want you to be able to use some of these platforms, but really understand the bigger picture. And we would recommend things like these test and learn approaches. So, giving yourself enough pieces of creative to be able to A/B test different pieces of content, making sure you have enough of a budget to be able to leverage those learnings and work out what is working and then continue to drive results. We often see wineries putting $100 behind something and then going, it's not working, or $100 and it works and they're not fueling that with the further funds. So there's a really great opportunity here to look at your creative and think about how you're evolving in this paid space. If you are new to this, there's some really good information on some of the Meta business platforms. Go and Google it. They've got some great information about how do you start, what are you able to use Business Manager and Google and Meta Ads Manager for. Go and have a read. And again, we're always here. We have Fiona as our paid media specialist who does this day to day. So if you've got any questions once you've had a look, be sure to reach out and we're able to assist. Now, before I move on to the final couple of slides, it's worth talking about Google. We were talking about social media today, but remember that Google ads also play a role. And often for a different demographic of consumer, they'll often have a look at how they're using Google as the first point of search. So if I'm looking at where I'm going to go in Orange as a winery, for example, I might start as someone in my 40s on Google. My kids might start on TikTok. But thinking about that broader mix and who your consumer would look like, Google ads are continuing to evolve. And just like Meta, their AI tools and machine learning is continuing to give much more targeting options. Okay, so final couple of slides, importance of measurement. This is really easy to be wasting time and money without measuring and optimizing your results. So really critical for you to spend the time understanding what are you trying to measure and know that there's different attribution systems between Meta and between Google. And what I mean behind that is when you're looking at performance on Meta, they will obviously look at a 7-day window of where that activity will come from. So sometimes the results that come through from Meta are overinflated, whereas Google works on what they call a last click attribution. So the very last click on the ad is where consumers are going to be able to get the sale. You need to look at the bigger picture and really understand some of the metrics that are working. So don't just be sold on things like this is the reach and this is how many impressions. They're old metrics. You need to measure the things that are making a really big difference in your business. So things like, what impact is this having in terms of our word of mouth? How are we measuring website traffic? Is there a drop in website traffic because of social media? How long are they spending on site? What is the increase in leads? How are we nurturing people in our emails? Where is our email revenue up? These sorts of conversations need to build your dashboards to work out what is success looking for. Just finally, an opportunity here for you to think about how you put some of these tips into practice. Many of you will know that next week is the 5th annual Shiraz Day. It is held on the 4th Thursday in the month in July. The date does change because we often sell more wine on a Thursday or a Friday. So be aware that the date actually changes from year to year. We've got some tools on our mastermind website for those of you who want to use some of that free information. There's some gifts, there's some information on how you can best leverage that. And we're also working on a Fiano campaign for Christmas kind of summer activation. So if any of you are selling a fabulous Fiano and you want to get involved, send me an email to Trish at Mastermind Consulting. And we'll make sure that you've got the information on how to get involved in a fabulous Fiano campaign. So last recap, we've covered a lot today. I'm hoping that you have got something out of it. We'd love to hear from you on the types of content that you found valuable. Just recapping, this is a really exciting opportunity still for wine brands, but don't put all of your eggs in this basket. You really need to think about, what does your integrated approach look like? How is this building into your strategy? And how do you play to a very different landscape in this kind of social media arena? Don't neglect any other parts of your marketing mix, because you still need to focus on strategic brand marketing, owned assets that you can control. I talk about email marketing importance over and over again, because for many brands, that is the love letter to your consumers. So think about what you can control. And if you have any questions, send us a note. We send out our information. When we're seeing these platform changes, we'll often run webinars like this, and we would love to connect. So just opening it back up, I think there may be a couple of questions that we have a couple of minutes to answer.
Yep. There's not very much time. Sabina did ask a question, but Emma actually answered it. So what was the source of the information on the DTC emails rising 50% of revenue? And we understand that that's from your own clients, Trish, from Mastermind clients.
That's correct.
I think I'll just quickly pick out a few things that really stood out to me today that were learnings for me. That social media has become the main search engine. I think that's really interesting. That we need to give content time to breathe, because I think there really is a temptation to fill up your calendar, your content calendar, with a whole bunch of content and not giving it enough time to breathe. Think you're having to do 3 posts a week or whatever. The rise of ugly content. And I guess that's really great, because often as marketers, we're a bit worried that our winemaker isn't great at delivering the right kind of video content. But now perhaps them just walking along and just talking about something is okay. It's okay for them to do that. And the fact that you can use the employer generated content too, so that if you've got a more talented kind of storyteller in your organization, it's okay to use them. I think also the storytelling on carousels is something that we have noticed, but using that really effectively is good to know how to do that. So Trish, just a question, like, how would you balance, how many carousels would you, because you obviously can't just do storytelling on carousels as every one of your posts every week. So how would you balance kind of some of that ugly content and the storytelling on carousels versus a simple picture post?
Yeah, we still do look at how we plan that, as a calendar, not necessarily these are the 3 posts that you need to put up, but it's that real mix of content. So how have we got some entertaining content? How have we got some education? Often the carousels will be part of the education. Or it could be as simple as that instead of putting up, we've got a few at the moment of voting for the Halliday Awards. If you put your roundel on 2 pieces of content on a carousel, it may mean that you're getting greater reach without amplifying that. So being quite strategic on how you use it and what type of content you're using is part of that planning mix each month as you go into that.
We've got a question from Elise Facina, who's asked any more specific advice about videos for Reels, like best length of time or how regular to actually post Reels?
Yeah, it depends obviously on the platform. Short is often performing quite well on Instagram, so that really snappy content. The word is obviously, though, if you're using that content on YouTube Shorts, longer content often works really hard on YouTube Shorts. So again, it depends on your strategy, but keep it sometimes engaging and tell the story that you need to. And don't be scared to say to the winemaker, okay, this is what I need you to say. It doesn't need to waffle. These are the 3 points in your words, and then help them be able to deliver that message works really effectively.
It is 1:30 here in South Australia and 2 o'clock elsewhere. So we do have to wrap it up. The last question was Meta Business Suite is so confusing. That is a question that cannot be answered in a short period of time. So if you're finding Meta Business Suite confusing, you probably actually need a professional to sort of explain it to you, because it really is not easy.
I should say we have a timesheet element where our team actually timesheet the meta makeups where, it just goes AWOL, or they've changed it and it's taken double the amount of time to do something because meta continues to change.
Very good. All right. So we will wrap it up today. Thank you so much, Trish, for giving us your insights into social media and how it looks in 2025. It is evolving, but some of those big platforms are still there and still the ones that we're using mostly. Our next webinar is on the 12th of August. Stay tuned in our newsletter to find out what the topic is going to be. And remember that all of the past webinars are recorded, so members can access those for free on our website. So thanks very much, everyone, for participating, for watching, and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone. Lovely to have you on the call.